Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices this season from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. Artificial intelligence as a technology has taken the world by storm over the last 2 years. So many of us, both in the tech world and beyond, have been so caught up in the promises and potential of AI that not enough introspection and thinking has happened on its pitfalls. The pace of development has been so rapid that the world has not had a moment to even pause and think about the unintended consequences of AI. How is AI changing what it means to be human? What might be the unintended consequences of AI on individuals, families, societies, and cultures around the world? Will AI exacerbate the inequalities that exist in the world, or will it help alleviate them? Will power get more concentrated in the hands of a few, or will it diffuse more widely? And most importantly, can anything be done about all of this? In other words, what are some of the policy implications that arise out of these unintended consequences of the spread of AI around the world? Joining us today to discuss these questions with me is Madhumita Murgia. Madhumita Murgia was appointed as the first AI editor of the Financial Times in February 2023. She joined the FT in 2016 and was its European technology correspondent before taking her present role. She was previously tech editor at The Telegraph and associate editor of Wired UK. Her latest book, Code Dependent, was shortlisted for the 2024 Women's Prize for Nonfiction and explores in detail the unintended consequences of AI. Madhumita, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Madhu, I want to start off, with a simple question, but I want to help you lay out the context for our listeners about your book. What led you to write the book? What was some of the research that you did that underlies this book, and what eventually was the core argument or the core conclusions you draw in the book basis that research?
Thank you. Thank you. So I've been writing about AI since about 2013. So it's been more than 10 years at this point that I've been following this story and grappling with the impacts and implications as well as explaining the technology itself. And I've really seen it grow from, something that was much more of a kind of research model, a sort of experiment to the technology we see today that's so deeply embedded and widely available through the consumer products that we are all playing with and working with on a daily basis, right? And for me, through the years of covering this and watching the coverage of it more broadly, I felt that there was a huge missing part of the story, which was the human stories, the human impacts of the technology, because it so closely affects us, right? More than possibly any technology in history, we're using AI to make decisions that are really consequential about our lives, whether that's in healthcare or public services, criminal justice, now creativity. um and it's changing really the way that we work, the way that we communicate with one another, and I wanted to explore what that meant for ordinary people, not just those who are building the technology, largely based in the Western United States. So the goal to write of this book was to find those ordinary human stories and through them hold up a mirror to how AI is changing our society. So the process really involved finding 9 or 10 of these stories, and I wanted it to be a very global book. So that was a key driver for me, that I wanted to step out of the Western bubble of just
Yeah.
focusing on the creators of the technology and those who are sort of building it, and look in parts of the world that we don't often include in the conversation around AI, and that includes everywhere from Latin America to East Africa, India, of course, and China too, and other parts of the world where I travel to find these stories. And I guess the thesis that came out of the book through my reporting was really showing how in action AI fails over and over again, and how with the best of intentions and the optimism that's brought to the building of this technology, the idea that it can solve these messy human problems, often when it's actually implemented, because of the lack of accountability, the inherent harms and biases within the technology itself, we're seeing that it's affecting the most vulnerable people. And I show examples of this with whether it's migrants, refugees, women, racial minorities. In every one of these contexts, these are the people who are harmed by the impacts of AI, while the benefits are being accrued by a few. So you can actually see the inequalities widening. And so for me, this was sort of a call to action about bringing in more people into the conversation to ask, is this the future that we want to see?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a piece, I want to now dig deeper into, which is this idea of the concentration of power. I think you've called it the elephant in the room. It's something I wrote about in my book also, I think, as we were briefly discussing earlier, The Great Tech Game, where I talk about this rise of the big tech firms, and in this case, of course, as you rightly mentioned, a lot of the AI technologies today are being developed um, in a very concentrated fashion in the Western United States, in Silicon Valley, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about that concentration of power piece, because obviously that has great implications for our politics and for our society. Um, it's clear to many that the big tech firms are obviously leading this AI charge, but talk to us about what are some of the maybe ingredients of that concentration of power that you've seen, that you've unpacked, and whether you see this concentration, both in terms of development and shaping the future direction of the technology, to be inevitable? Is it unavoidable, or is there something that can be done about it? And if
Yeah.
so, who or what can be done about it?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've seen the development of this power imbalance over the last decade or so, right? We've seen it with the rise of big tech companies, particularly in social media. And we've seen how many of these companies are larger than countries, than most countries, and in terms both of their the money that they have, the investment that they're able to make into infrastructure, but also the number of people that they touch and that they influence, right? And when it came to regulation of the social media platforms, all countries came to it very late, right? We got to it at a point, these companies already had access to people, that there was already this relationship between the consumer and the company, and there was no way to get them to kind of follow regulations. They were pretty much self-regulated. With AI, we're seeing that concentration deepen even further. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, in order to build complex and sophisticated AI systems, you require huge amounts of data. And really, it's only the big tech companies today that have access to these volumes of data, whether that's behavioral data or creative data, images and text, and so on. Companies like Google and Facebook, this has been their business model for the last 10 years. It's also a very expensive endeavor. Building generative AI in particular, scaling up the size of these models is requiring billions, if not trillions of dollars, right? Sam Altman recently, was reported as saying that he would require $7 trillion to build a truly sophisticated AI system, which, feels like a made up number when you think about where that would even come from. But again, these trillion-dollar companies are the ones with access to this type of capital, right? And finally, the infrastructure. To build more new generations of AI systems, you require cloud computing at scale, and the infrastructure is owned by a handful of companies, right? There are only four or so companies that run the cloud computing
Yeah.
networks, and even governments are dependent on them. The Indian government runs much of its services on AWS. Others around the world are dependent, Microsoft
Yeah.
Azure or Google Cloud. And so again, you've sort of come back to the same three or four names again that also run the pipes. So you're seeing, already regulators are becoming alive to this. In antitrust areas in particular in the US and the UK and in Europe, they're looking at, is it even possible to be a startup anymore that can build a model? What about researchers? Are they able to do independent research that's holding, this work to account? And increasingly, that's becoming hard to do because of the lack of these three sort of big ingredients. And so I think that we do need to watch closely as we start to embed these large language models and AI
No,
systems,
absolutely,
whether into the
absolutely. And
workplace, into
do you have a
education.
sense from the work you've done or the conversations you've had that there's something that can be done about it beyond obviously the antitrust actions that regulators around the world have been trying to take over the last
Yeah.
2 years against some of the tech firms?
Well, I think that governments will have to create their own alternative infrastructures, right? We can't be fully dependent on a private cloud forever. So I think you're seeing, for example, the UAE government is starting to build its own open source language model as an alternative to the commercial ones out there, and also to build up their own capacity in terms of data centers and cloud. And I think more and more you'll see these sort of sovereign plays from governments around the world that will want to own every piece of this so that they can provide it as a public service rather than be reliant on, private corporations to provide it as a paid service.
And of course, that's an uphill task, right? I mean, these hyperscalers, these cloud computing players, the infrastructure, the data, the tech layer is not easy for any government to build, let alone a smaller government. Even if the big ones like India and the UK and France and Germany might attempt something like this, but it might be much, much harder for smaller countries to attempt this.
No,
But in,
absolutely.
in,
And
in,
this is
in
why
in
this
any case, I
concept
think
of,
the
yeah, this is why the concept of data colonialism, I think, is such an interesting one, right? You can see who the winners and losers will come out to be when you have an environment like this. So, and you will see that gap
yeah,
widening.
yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the data colonialism piece, the digital colonialism more broadly piece that you've written about, and the conversations you've had with Nick Colry at LSE as we were discussing is something I also did for my book and the research I was doing. And so I'm very interested in that concept. So for our listeners, why don't you lay out the parallels that you see and that, the conversation with Nick also threw up between what we obviously know in history as that colonial period and today's world. And where do you find gaps in that analogy as well? Talk to us whether you found any gaps in that analogy, or whether you found that analogy as Nick has propagated to be completely robust.
Yeah, so for me, it was really fascinating because when I spoke to him about this theory, it actually brought to life many of the examples that I was reporting in my book and helped me to connect the dots between them. So it went from being, a series of vignettes of human experiences to actually having an undercurrent that sort of underpins all these stories, to help explain why it's happening. So this concept that he talks about is really about um, the sort of new form of colonialism, which involves Western companies going to the global south, or even to vulnerable communities within the global north, and sort of plundering them for data, or this exploitative and extractive process of taking data from them to build these big technology frameworks that don't often benefit them and might even harm the people who have given up their data, right? And where I saw it really
Yeah.
resonating was when I
Did you
looked at
find that to
how.
be fully convincing, or did you find that maybe there were
Yeah.
some
No, I think there
differences
are
also
holes.
in the two
Of course, when having grown up in India and studied the history of, British colonialism in India, there was a lot of, the harm that we see that was enacted is so much more extreme than when we look at what's happening with AI or with data, right? In terms of enslavement of indigenous people and people in the colonized countries, and the physical plundering for materials and resources that has resulted in sort of decades of poverty and exploitation. We're not seeing that yet, but I think from on a if we're trying to make this argument, I see why we call it colonialism, because it is very much an extractive and exploitative process, right? Because we are asking ASHA workers on the front lines in India to collect health data about citizens and using that to build AI systems for healthcare, but they're never informed what's done with their data and often never see the results or the benefits of that. And I think there's so much wealth accruing in Silicon Valley amongst these companies. These are all $1-2 trillion companies now. And there hasn't been simultaneous upliftment or economic empowerment that we're seeing from the parts of the world who have contributed to the data that's key, that's required to build these AI systems. And the other kind of interesting parallel is the role of the company, right? The corporation as a quasi state. And that I thought was fascinating. We've read about the East India Company. There are examples of this with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation as well. But here you really are seeing these companies playing, in many cases, the role of a state, and in many cases more powerful than the state, which I find to be kind of a really fascinating parallel. What did you
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
Anirudh?
Yeah, no, I found the I think the points that Nick raises and that you also highlight in your book, right? And I was saying I had a full chapter in my book on this idea of digital colonialism as well. And what I found was that I think drawing out some of these parallels is very important because it at least makes people aware, right? See, in countries like India, which have had colonial histories, um, making these parallels are very powerful political statements, right? Because countries like India are very clear that you don't ever want that kind of relationship to ever come into existence again, right? Where
Yeah.
there's a colonial master and you are a subject, right? And so I think drawing out these parallels is a very important piece so that people's ears are perked up and they're aware,
And
right?
it's a
That
lens,
these
right?
relationships could devolve
Yeah.
into that kind of
Yeah, and I
master
think it's a
servant
lens.
relationship.
A lens through which we can view the impacts and consequences of this, right? It helps us. It helps to interpret it and see what the relationships look like.
Yeah, yeah. That said, I think the other piece that I would highlight is that there is a counter narrative here. I think that the times are different. Colonial history has happened, and we are very much aware, let's say in a country like India, about it. The fact that we are aware also makes us hyper aware, as I was saying, of any such relationship sometimes happening. And I find that in today's era, there are going to be some critical differences. One, countries like India, at least, are very much aware of this. So you'll see that the state is very much um, insisting that the laws of our land need to be followed. Often there are then calls for an equal playing field. If you look at India's digital public infrastructure efforts, the DPI efforts coming out of India, one can very easily see them as efforts to make sure that there's a level playing field, right, between firms, and that no one big foreign firm or big, foreign firm really for anywhere should have a undue advantage over smaller firms or startups coming out of India. But I worry a lot more actually about the smaller states. I think governments like India and some others, even those who have colonial histories, some are actually a lot more prepared for this kind of to avoid this kind of relationship. But I worry about other smaller nations which might not have the kind of market, for example, power that India can exert against these big tech firms. And there I worry about this relationship devolving into data colonialism or digital colonialism type relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that's why global governance is going to be very important. Regulation will be very important. I think governments being aware,
Yeah.
public, the
Yeah,
folks,
but and I think
people,
yeah,
society
civil
aware.
society I think plays also a really crucial role here because you can't just have government top down rules at that, because these companies have huge lobbying arms and of course they're going to be able to make sure that they're adhering to the sort of letter of the law while still growing their businesses. I think what's equally in some ways important is civil society, and for me that's research, right? That's university based independent academia, and you need to have a rich,
Yeah.
academic sector to hold these advancements to account and to be able to audit them. And that is another thing that I've reported on also over the last 5 years or so, has really declined. Um, Even people at places like Stanford today, there are academics who say we don't have the compute, we don't have the money, we're not able to build our own models to test some of the claims made by companies, right? And that weakens our ability as a public to hold these claims to account, and or to even build guardrails around them, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Let's move. I think this is a topic I agree with you that needs a lot more research, and it's very important at the same time to not, I think, be lazy in drawing these analogies. I think that's one of the conclusions I drew in the book, that sometimes the flip side of what we are just discussing is that it's very easy for leaders, political leaders, to use um, parallels and analogies with the East India Company and other such colonial corporations, and compare any foreign firm or any large business and make them sound like they are the next East India Company. So I think it's very important to make sure that these analogies are not drawn in lazy, unresearched, or
Yeah,
unsubstantiated ways, because I think then that takes away from the seriousness of the topic itself. But the next
yeah,
piece I want to move to, Madhu, is the piece that you've highlighted in some of the stories that you've drawn out in your book, and I want to talk about the data workers specifically as a critical part of this AI value chain, right? While the compute might be concentrated, the top tier research might be concentrated, um, some of the other infrastructure like cloud computing, etc., is concentrated in the hands of a few. The piece that seems to be being outsourced to countries like India and countries in Africa, etc., is the data collection, the data annotation, the data tagging. These data workers that are in many ways the unlooked or the highlighted piece of the AI value chain. And you've written a lot about that. When I was reading that piece in your book, it almost in my head I was drawing parallels with how at some point when the internet had come out, people used to think of the internet as this um, as a thing that had no physical element to it, right? And then, of course, people famously described it as a series of tubes, and now, of course, we understand. I think years later that the internet, while it might seem like the digital world and might seem like the virtual world, it really has a physical layer underlying it, a very important physical layer in terms of today data centers and hardware and undersea cables. Similarly, on the AI side, when I was reading about the data workers you were talking about, they seem to me the invisible part today of the AI value chain. But talk to us about that. Talk to us
yeah.
about why you feel they've been not highlighted as much, why you feel the need for them to be highlighted more, and also how you anticipate that more value can flow to them when ultimately, if you look at the AI game as being played out between the big tech firms and in the US, they don't seem to care about that piece, right? They seem to care about who'll have the best talent, who'll have the best research coming out of it, who'll have the next best model. So how will these AI workers ultimately get, I guess, what you've called like a fairer share of the value chain?
Yeah. So, yes, I think that's a really interesting parallel with the sort of physical manifestation of the internet, and then similarly, what the physical bits and the people behind AI look like.
Yeah,
And for me, when I was setting out to write a book about people and how they're affected by AI, I felt like this was a natural starting point, right? Because there are, hundreds of thousands of workers around the world who are responsible for helping train these AI systems. Yet, the way that most people see them is as this magical self-learning technology that somehow has a superior intelligence to many humans, and that it somehow gained just from looking at data, right? But that isn't true. And I think understanding who these people are and what they do actually helps also to elucidate how AI works, what's required to build these AI systems, and who is the labor workforce that's going to be involved in this as the technology continues to be developed, right? So I went to Kenya, to Nairobi, and also to Sofia in Bulgaria, to visit workers from two companies. So in both cases, these are outsourcers, middlemen, who are employing those who they believe are vulnerable. So, in the case of Bulgaria, they really focus on people affected by war, so refugees from the Middle East broadly and Afghanistan. And in the case of Kenya, they mostly draw on young people from slums, Kibera being the biggest slum in Africa, which is based in Nairobi, to give them an opportunity to do digital work with minimum pay and certain benefits, including sick pay and so on. So, for them to kind of step out of manual labor and be given an opportunity in a new digitized world. So, it really good intentions, and I think can be life changing for many that I spend time with. I know I was in India, and some of the people I spoke to there were saying actually this would be an amazing way to bring young people out of the agrarian economy, out of agriculture, and actually bring them to digital work. And this could be life changing, and why not? So for me, it was about exploring that nuance. There has been some coverage of data laborers, and just to explain what they do. So when you are driving, say, a Tesla or any kind of car that has a self-driving component, for that car to understand what it's looking at, whether that's the road, pedestrians, animals at a crossing, traffic signals, etc., it has to be taught. And it's taught by labels. So you have humans who watch
Correct.
hours and hours of videos, who are sitting and labeling, doing little bounding boxes saying this is a cloud, this is a truck, etc. This is true of text. So OpenAI has done this with ChatGPT, humans who say this is bad, don't do this, this is hateful, or this is illegal speech, or this is over sexualized, or whatever the case may be, but this is appropriate and okay. So it's humans who are being used to sort of fine tune these models based on text. So this is
To
the
be
case.
clear, Madhu, none of this is new, right? I think even in the internet
Yeah,
world,
I mean, this has been going
even
on
with
for
e-commerce
at
sites,
least,
yeah,
exactly, it's
we've
been going
invested
on
in
for a
companies that
decade.
were, yeah, yeah, that's right. We've invested in companies that were aggregating this kind of worker community globally as gig workers to do tagging on even e-commerce products, right? To say, okay,
Exactly.
this product is this and this category. So none of this data tagging, data annotation work is new. So then why worry so much about this?
Well,
Is I
it's
think
just
the question I'm asking,
we're
and
entering
what
an
can be done about
era.
it.
We're entering an era where AI is exploding, right? And there are billions of dollars being invested into building new models. And in order to tune those models, you're going to need more people. And more people, at scale means you have to turn to the developing world where the costs are lower for labor. So we're going to see more of this. And to spend time and understand how it affects them helps us to figure out, as you asked, what is a fair wage, what are fair labor practices, and also beyond that, if we are going to move into we're talking about this as the next industrial revolution, where we are all going to benefit from the wealth that's being produced by AI. How can we include everybody in that journey, and not just those who are already rich and making them richer, right? And for me, that was the takeaway, that yes, it helps to give people digital jobs, it helps to bring them out of poverty in many cases, but their agency is also heavily curtailed. They sign NDAs, they often don't know who they are even working for. If they want to have a voice to change the way something works, they're told they're not allowed to do that. And in cases where there has been exploitation, like for example when they're training content filtration algorithms, right, where they're helping to train, say, on Meta's platforms, on Facebook and Instagram, you have people in Kenya and elsewhere who are training the systems that decide what's illegal content. Terrorism, violence, all of this content is being watched by these people day in and day out to tag them, right? And this is deeply psychologically damaging. And if they stand up and say that they want protection for that, they are fired or silenced. So I think,
Yeah,
the question now is, yes, they, of course, nobody's saying that taggers need to be paid the same as the sort of highly valued and highly sought after AI engineers who sit at the
research taggers, yeah.
completely other end of the spectrum, where you can have $1 million salary as a
Yeah.
PhD. But at the same time, the gap is so vast, even between laborers who are doing this in the global south versus those doing this in Western countries. And why have that gap at all? It's the same job. And this, I
Yeah,
think this
yeah.
is a question for economists as well, trying to work out, how to bring up the wages without distorting the economy and so on, and which is not necessarily my area. But for me, it feels clear that they're being paid the same as they would for any other minimum wage job. And why is that the case? When this is a multi-billion dollar technology that is supposed to kind of hugely increase economic wealth across the world. I don't know if you
Yeah,
have
I think
thought.
fairer guidelines, etc., and being conscious about the issue is the first step. And then, of course, I think, much like, one can draw parallels even with gig workers for e-commerce deliveries, food deliveries, your Ubers of the world. I think it was at some point governments had to step in to say that, listen, we cannot have gig workers be completely without any kind of protection that we otherwise give to labor or people working in other industries. So I think it's a important point to raise so that the necessary thinking can go into how to
Yeah.
ensure that the conditions are fair and so on and so forth. Of course, other than wages, right? Other than what you've termed as unfair wages, let's say, for some of the data workers, you've highlighted some other harms, unintended, often harms that you saw amongst different marginalized communities, right? And as people think about the impact AI is having on society, I think it's important to highlight some of those other pieces also to both raise awareness and then hopefully drive the conversation around how those harms can be mitigated or prevented. So, talk to us about maybe one or two other kinds of harms that you were seeing as part of your research that you think are important for policymakers to keep in mind and for the big tech firms to keep in mind.
Yeah. So I would say that broadly, this you can kind of divide up the harms. Either it's because inherently of bias within the technology. And we know, because of how AI systems are trained on existing data, they're a reflection, they're a mirror of the society that we live in. So when we are building, say, an AI recruitment system that's supposed to, help hire people, it's really going to reflect who we've hired in the past, and the same biases that we see in historical hires are going to be replicated, right? So in my book, I talk about criminal justice as an example, where you have in Amsterdam the local government, the mayor's office, put out an algorithm that was going to predict children who would go on to commit crimes in the future. So very much Minority Report style system. And again, this was a good intention. The goal was to identify families that require help, where the public systems can intervene early and assist and support. But in practice, because of how it was designed and the data it was trained on, most of the people on this list, the young people on this list, came largely from migrant communities from North Africa who had settled in Amsterdam, and tended to be boys, young men, disproportionately, the majority of them. And so you can see how, even if you build a system that's supposed to be race blind or gender blind, you end up with something that's targeting a very specific part of the population that's already vulnerable, that's already, coming into unequal contact with the police, that has struggled to integrate into the local communities, and they feel even more sort of under a spotlight, like they've done something wrong, and which kind of tears apart the social fabric of that city, right? So we have to be very careful. This is beyond good intentions, and beyond saying that we are not including certain variables, therefore this is fair, because often these consequences crop up anyway. um, and this shows up again, whether that's in healthcare. When you look at healthcare algorithms, you find that they can be biased against those who are not able to access healthcare because they are not as widely represented within the data, for example.
Yeah.
So that's one class, where it's sort of the technology itself. But often I found that it wasn't just a technical issue, it was a human issue, right? It's how these systems are implemented and how we oversee them. And one of the stories I tell is about an AI system in Argentina that was used to predict teenage pregnancies, amongst families, about girls living in a city in Salta. And there, it wasn't necessarily a problem with the technology, with the AI system being biased, but it was about how they implemented it, where they just sort of went to families, collected the data, created a system, and eventually the AI system said more than 70% of the people in this community were likely to have a teenage pregnancy in their families. What does that tell us? That there's a wider societal issue here,
Yeah,
and the fix is not technical, right? The fix has to come from support from the state and so on, but you kind of rely on a technology to fix the problem, and actually nobody benefits in the end. It was abandoned. So I
yeah,
think it's not always just the technology that fails, but also how we roll it out, and how we include the people that it affects, in the building and the implementation of it.
yeah, yeah. No, one of the clear learnings from, I think, the ills of the internet or the social media addiction that we've been seeing, right, is one of the clear learnings is that the harms that come, or the biases that are propagated, or the flawed values that sometimes technology seems to propagate. Let's say in case of social media, many people have spoken about the attention deficit that it has caused, etc. I think often come to light much later, right? Once the technology has gone propagated. And I think the other key learning is that humans are humans. Their flaws, their ills, their frailties, their vices don't go away. And people do figure out uses of technology that are not often well intentioned either.
Yeah.
So there's a massive human element, and that's why I think many people who are studying technology from a societal standpoint, many of whom I spoke to also, tend to say that we have to realize that the relationship between technology and humans has to be a two-way street. It
Yeah.
cannot be that humans are simply just taking the technology as it's been developed and then using
Yeah.
it or adopting it, but really we've got to have a much more widespread conversation amongst humans, amongst societies, to talk about the values that we want to make sure that are embedded in the technologies
Yeah.
also to begin with.
This
Yeah,
is where the title of my book comes from, right? Code
correct.
dependent. It's
That's
about we shape the technology shapes us. And I think so many people feel that they're cut out of this conversation because it has to be tech companies or people who understand, the workings of it, who can have a say in it, or maybe governments who regulate. But actually, this
yeah,
is much more a conversation about what sort of values do we want to have if we're going to automate these very sort of human parts of our society, whether that's who goes to jail, or what children are taught at school. These are all things that have values and culture embedded into them, and we are putting machines into this. This is also true of personal relationships. You're now seeing AI systems being used as therapists, for in dating apps. So it's kind of shaping us at a very personal level. So I think that it's
yeah,
very important for us to figure out today what sort of values do we want out of these systems. Do we just want it to be a Western value system that gets propagated around the world, or how do we include the nuance of other cultures and other ethical
yeah, yeah,
systems too?
yeah. The we has to be much broader than we being a few people, a few folks sitting in a given office, a given lab. And at the same time, it has to be geographically, as you're rightly saying. I think geographically, also culturally, also more representative of the world. And I think that's why it's very important that, what we started off the conversation with. So it's very important that the development of AI, in this case, the development of the technology we are focusing on today, becomes much more broad based, right?
Yeah.
I think that's very important because only then the values that various societies or various people hold dear will then get reflected in a more representative way.
Yeah.
If the technology continues to be developed only in very concentrated parts of the world, then we're likely to see specific sets of values being propagated.
Yeah.
I want to, in the interest of time, I want to move now to talking about AI in India, Madhu. So, in 2018, when the first document came out of the Indian government, out of the Niti Aayog in particular, one of the key phrases that that document put out was in line with what we've just discussed. It said hashtag AI for all, right? And from the very beginning, in many ways, the focus has been, as you can imagine, in a country as socio-politically and economically diverse as India, governments always tend to emphasize inclusive growth, inclusive development. Obviously, these are lofty goals. Often you find it hard to ultimately meet many of these lofty goals fully. But the idea was AI for all, right? Now, the question for you is, I know you were in India recently. You obviously grew up here, as you were mentioning as well. Um, Talk to us about how you anticipate India being able to take advantage of the opportunities and potential that AI offers today,
Yeah.
especially given the work you've done globally, the kind of reporting you've done from around the world. Um, and tell me if there were any particular kinds of guardrails or particular kinds of harms that you think are especially important for India to keep in mind and for Indian policymakers to keep in mind as they draft out the guardrails for AI and the regulation for AI going forward.
Yeah. So, yes, so I grew up in Mumbai, but my family's from the south. So I span sort of Chennai, Bangalore, and Mumbai, and I spent time just this past month traveling between, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore to talk about the issues in this book. And it really struck me how engaged and passionate the conversation is, how people, the ages of people who were passionate and in discussing this range from sort of the very young college students, even high school, all the way to, my 90-year-old grandmother came along to one of these discussions and was engaged in it
Mhm.
too. So I just love that spread. And I think, what's amazing about how India is approaching this is with that optimism of trying to solve the really big unwieldy problems that we see in India, but more broadly, in society, including access to healthcare, as you said, AI for all, and sort of seeing how AI can be harnessed for good, which I think is why it's so important to be having the conversation outside of just the West, because when you have private corporations who are leading the conversation, of course it's going to be focused on things like workplace productivity and economic growth, and ultimately they have to make money from this because they've been pumping so much money into it that there has to be something to show for it for them to also reinvest. So there's a lot of focus there on sort of convenience, increased efficiency, productivity at work. But you do need to have people who are thinking about other sort of big picture problems that AI can address, which I see mostly coming out of countries that have different challenges to the West, like India. And so, actually, the example that I focus on most deeply in my book, from in an Indian context, is healthcare. And the person that I focus on, the story is of a doctor, Dr. Ashita Singh, who is working in a very rural part of Maharashtra and on the Gujarat border, who's helping to train and test a tuberculosis spotting AI system. And most of the patients she sees are from Adivasi communities, the Bhil tribes, who often just cannot see doctors because of where they are or other sort of cultural obstacles. But for her, this could be genuinely life saving if you are able to roll out mobile vans with, it's simply an app on a phone that can filter who does
Yeah.
or doesn't have TB, right? And you can see how that access could genuinely change lives. And so, for that is where I think that in areas like healthcare, is where we have the uh, of course you need the money and the infrastructure, but where we can really make a difference. And we have the people that we can help to train the technology onto, who will see the benefits of it as well at scale. And I think in terms of how we can contribute to the development of the technology, we have a million engineers, I think, graduating every year in India. We have a huge talent base, engineering minded, quantitatively minded workforce. And I think it's about figuring out how to build on top of these model companies and to create applications that are not the same sort of consumer focused applications we're seeing coming out of the West, but that can actually work in an Indian context. And
Yeah.
and we need to focus on not trying to necessarily build your own LLM, which, yes, I think we should be looking at who should do that as well. But beyond that, there's going to be an explosion of the app layer on top of language models that are thinking about focused applications in different areas, from science or healthcare or education, climate, and so on, energy, which I think we should be focused on solving.
Absolutely. I think the applications that can focus on solving, as you said, right, many of the seemingly intractable problems that India faces, especially in basic um, sectors, right, basic social sectors like healthcare, education, agriculture, so on and so forth, are important, right? Similar examples, I think, in my many conversations around this come up, right? Simple detection of diseases in crops through
Yeah,
simple apps can help farmers improve their
yeah,
productivity. Education, I was just watching the video that Sahil Khan put out of personalized tutoring, right? I mean, it's clear that in India, an education revolution enabled by AI, where you can do personalized education in the language, um, easily accessible, cheaply accessible for millions of our students who still don't get the kind of education that they deserve, I
yeah,
think could ultimately transform the Indian workforce also, right?
yeah.
Just from a health education standpoint. So I think
And
the
I think even on
potentials are,
a
of course,
more
immense. Yeah.
ambitious level, looking at how AI can be applied to the science of energy problems, right? How do we solve things like water crises? How can we, what sort of energy breakthroughs can we try and accelerate through the use of AI? We have the scientific expertise also. We've done this in space research, for example. So I think it would be really
Yeah.
fascinating to see how we could marry the power of AI with with scientific progress too, to solve some of those bigger, more ambitious problems as well.
Yeah. No, I think worldwide now, there's a lot of talk around how AI can enable much better scientific research and help scientists also become more effective in detecting patterns and, of course, drug discovery, protein folding, all of those pieces are already being done. But yeah,
Yeah.
much more broadly applied to science, I think there's a lot of potential for India to also up its game and capabilities in R&D. But thank you so much, Madhu. I know we've covered a lot of ground in the last 45 minutes or so, and we could go on. These are topics that are very close to my heart as well. But thank you so much for sharing your time and insights, and we look forward to seeing you again in India. Um, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And thank you for listening. See you next time.
Thank you.